The dust on Natalie Kendall's worn boots told the story of 7 rejected proposals in 3 months. But it was the way her 5-year-old son clutched her hand that morning in September 1877 that nearly broke her resolve to keep trying. Pecos, Texas stretched before them like a promise half-kept, the wooden buildings shimmering in the heat as Natalie adjusted the weight of their single travel bag on her shoulder. Her late husband, James, had been dead for 2 years now, taken by fever during their wagon journey west, and every man since had looked at little Thomas with something between pity and resentment before finding reasons why marriage wouldn't work. The last one, a shopkeeper in Fort Stockton, had been brutally honest. "I want my own children, not another man's spawn," he'd said, and Natalie had gathered her son and left before the tears could fall. "Mama, I'm thirsty," Thomas said, his brown eyes squinting against the brutal Texas sun. "I know, sweetheart. We'll find the boarding house and get you some water." Natalie scanned the street, noting the saloon, the general store, the land office, and what appeared to be a small hotel with peeling paint that proclaimed it the Pecos Inn. Her money wouldn't last more than 2 weeks if she was careful, maybe 3 if she could find work immediately. The advertisement she'd answered had promised a position as a schoolteacher, but the letter in her pocket gave her an uneasy feeling. The handwriting had been rushed, almost desperate. They made their way down the main street, Thomas's small boots kicking up little clouds of dust with each step. A group of cowboys rode past, their horses' hooves creating a thunderous rhythm against the packed earth. Natalie pulled Thomas closer, protective as always, and noticed one of the riders glance back at them. He was tall in the saddle, with dark hair visible beneath his hat, and a face that seemed carved from determination and sun-weathered days. He slowed his horse, and for a moment Natalie thought he might stop, but then his companions called to him and he rode on. The Pecos Inn was slightly better inside than its exterior suggested. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair looked up from behind a small desk. "Help you, miss?" "I'm looking for room and board. I've come about the teaching position." The woman's expression shifted to something like sympathy mixed with awkwardness. "Oh dear, you haven't heard then?" Natalie's stomach dropped. "Heard what?" The school board decided they wanted a man for the position. Said it would be better discipline for the older boys. They hired someone 2 weeks ago, sent out letters to cancel the other candidates. The woman shook her head. "I'm sorry you came all this way." Thomas tugged on Natalie's skirt, sensing her distress. She forced herself to breathe, to think, to not let panic overwhelm her in front of her son. "I see. Well, is there any other work in town? I can sew, I can cook, I can keep books if needed." "Times are hard," the woman said, but not unkindly. "The drought's been tough on the ranchers, and most folks do their own sewing and cooking. There's Mrs. Patterson who runs the boarding house on 2nd Street. She's getting on in years and might need help. And the Last Chance Saloon is always looking for serving girls, but I don't suppose that's suitable for a woman with a child." Natalie's cheeks burned. She knew what kind of work saloons offered women, and she'd starve before she went down that path. "Thank you. I'll try Mrs. Patterson. In the meantime, could we afford one night here? And perhaps a meal?" The price the woman quoted was fair but would take a significant portion of Natalie's remaining money. She paid it anyway, knowing they both needed rest and food before she could think clearly about what came next. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed that she and Thomas would share, a washstand with a chipped basin, and a window that overlooked the street. Thomas immediately went to the window, pressing his nose against the glass to watch the activity below. Natalie sat on the bed and allowed herself exactly 1 minute of despair before straightening her spine and beginning to plan. That evening, after they'd eaten a simple meal of stew and bread in the inn's small dining room. Natalie left Thomas in the care of the innkeeper's wife and went to find Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if Natalie hadn't been so focused on her mission. The boarding house was a two-story structure that had seen better days but was well maintained. Mrs. Patterson herself answered the door, a tiny woman who couldn't have been more than 5 feet tall, with white hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. "Mrs. Patterson, my name is Natalie Kendall. I'm looking for work, and I was told you might need help with the boarding house." Mrs. Patterson looked her up and down. "You're the one who came for the teaching job. News travels fast. In Pecos, news travels faster than a prairie fire. Come in, girl. Let's talk." Mrs. Patterson led her into a small sitting room off the main hall. The house smelled of lye soap and coffee, and Natalie could hear the murmur of male voices from somewhere upstairs. "I've got 6 boarders, all men working various ranches or trades. I provide breakfast and supper, clean the rooms once a week, and do their laundry for an extra fee. I'm 73 years old and my bones ache something fierce. I could use help, that's true, but I heard you've got a child. A son, Thomas. He's 5, well-behaved, and I'd keep him out of the way. Children are never out of the way, and that's not necessarily a bad thing." "What happened to your husband?" The question was direct but not cruel. Natalie appreciated that. "Fever. 2 years ago on our way west. We were heading to California, but after he died, I didn't have the resources to continue. I've been working where I can, but most towns don't need teachers or seamstresses, and the ones that do don't want to hire a widow with a child." "Men are fools," Mrs. Patterson said bluntly. "A woman who can raise a child and keep working is worth 3 men in my estimation, but I can't pay much. Room and board for you and the boy, plus $3 a week. You'd work 6 days, help with all meals, cleaning, and laundry. Sundays would be your own for church or rest. The work is hard and my boarders can be particular." $3 a week was barely anything, but room and board was worth more than money when you had none. "I'll take it," Natalie said. "When can we start?" "Tomorrow morning. Be here by 5 to help with breakfast. You can move into the small room off the kitchen. It's not fancy, but it has a bed and a window, and there's space for a small cot for the boy." Relief flooded through Natalie so intensely she felt dizzy. Thank you so much." "Don't thank me yet. You haven't met my boarders. They're good men, but they're rough around the edges. Ranching will do that. My main rule is simple: no impropriety under my roof. You're a widow, they're mostly single men, and I won't have any scandal. You have my word, Mrs. Patterson. I'm here to work and provide for my son, nothing more." The old woman's expression softened slightly. "I believe you. Now go get some rest. 5 o'clock comes early." Natalie practically floated back to the inn. It wasn't the teaching position she'd hoped for, and $3 a week wasn't going to build them a future, but it was a start. It was survival. And from survival, she could perhaps eventually build something more. Thomas was already asleep when she returned, curled up on the bed with his thumb in his mouth, a habit he'd never fully broken. Natalie changed into her nightgown and lay beside him, listening to his soft breathing and feeling the weight of responsibility and love that had defined her life for 5 years. She must have slept, because the next thing she knew, pale dawn light was filtering through the window. She dressed quickly in her most practical dress, a gray cotton that had been mended more times than she could count, and woke Thomas gently. "We have a new home today," she told him as she helped him dress. "It's at a boarding house, and I'll be working there. You'll need to be very good and very quiet. Can you do that for me?" Thomas nodded solemnly. He'd learned early to adapt to their circumstances, and Natalie's heart ached for the carefree childhood he should have had. They gathered their few belongings and walked through the quiet morning streets to Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. The old woman was already in the kitchen when they arrived, stoking the fire in the large cast iron stove. "Good, you're punctual. Thomas, is it?" She addressed the boy directly, and he nodded. "There's a small yard out back where you can play when your mother's working. I've got a box of old toys from when my grandchildren visited. They're yours now, but when we call you in, you come immediately. Understand?" "Yes, madam," Thomas said quietly. He has manners. "That's good. Now, Natalie, let me show you where everything is, and then we'll start on breakfast. The men will be down by 6, and they expect their meal hot and ready." The next 2 hours passed in a blur of activity. Natalie learned where Mrs. Patterson kept the flour, the lard, the coffee, the salt pork. She learned that the boarders expected biscuits every morning, along with gravy, eggs when available, and always coffee strong enough to strip paint. She learned the rhythm of the kitchen, the way the old stove had hot spots and cool spots, the way Mrs. Patterson moved despite her aching bones with an efficiency born of decades of practice. At 6 o'clock precisely, heavy footsteps sounded on the stairs, and the boarders began filing into the dining room. Natalie stayed in the kitchen, helping Mrs. Patterson plate the food, but she could hear their voices, deep, masculine, discussing the day's work ahead. Ranch hands, by the sound of it, talking about cattle and water sources and the never-ending battle against the drought. "Natalie, bring out the biscuits," Mrs. Patterson instructed. She loaded a large plate with the golden biscuits she'd helped make and carried them into the dining room. 6 men sat around the long table, all weather-beaten and work-worn, all turning to look at her as she entered. She recognized one immediately. The cowboy from yesterday, the one who'd looked back at them on the street. Up close, she could see he was probably in his late 20s, with dark hair that needed cutting, eyes the color of a Texas sky just before a storm, and a face that was handsome in a rough-hewn way. His hands, wrapped around a coffee cup, were calloused and strong. "Gentlemen, this is Mrs. Kendall," Mrs. Patterson announced from the doorway. "She'll be helping me from now on. I expect you to treat her with respect." There was a murmur of acknowledgement. The cowboy was still looking at her, and Natalie felt her cheeks warm. She set down the biscuits and retreated to the kitchen, grateful for the excuse to escape those penetrating eyes. "That's Kyle Anderson," Mrs. Patterson said quietly, correctly interpreting Natalie's interest. "He's foreman at the Double A Ranch, about 10 miles north of town. Good man, hard worker, keeps to himself mostly. The others are ranch hands, various spreads around the area. They're here because they don't have families and the bunkhouses on the ranches are overcrowded. Why does the foreman live in town rather than on the ranch? The owner is back east most of the time, and Kyle manages everything. He says he likes the separation between work and rest. Comes to town 3 or 4 nights a week, spends the other nights at the ranch depending on what needs doing. He's been boarding here for 2 years now." Natalie filed that information away, though she told herself it didn't matter. She wasn't here to notice the boarders, no matter how striking their eyes were. She was here to work and keep her son safe. The morning routine continued. The men ate quickly and efficiently, thanked Mrs. Patterson for the meal, and headed out to their various employments. Kyle Anderson was the last to leave, and as he passed through the kitchen to reach the back door, he paused. "Madam," he said, addressing Natalie directly, "I saw you arrive yesterday. I hope Pecos treats you well." His voice was deeper than she'd expected, with a slight drawl that spoke of Texas roots. "Thank you, Mr. Anderson. I hope so too." He nodded and left, and Natalie found herself staring at the door he'd closed behind him. Don't get ideas, Mrs. Patterson said, but not unkindly. Kyle's a good man, but he's married to that ranch. He works sunrise to sunset and sometimes beyond. I've seen plenty of women try to catch his eye, and he's never been interested. I'm not looking to catch anyone's eye, Natalie said firmly. I've had enough rejection to last a lifetime. Mrs. Patterson's expression softened. Fair enough. Now let's clean up this kitchen and then I'll show you how I do the laundry around here. The days fell into a pattern. Natalie woke before dawn, helped prepare breakfast, cleaned the kitchen, and then tackled whatever other tasks Mrs. Patterson assigned. The work was hard and constant, but it was honest, and she had a roof over her head and food in her belly, and Thomas was safe. The boy played in the yard, helping with small tasks when he could, and slowly lost some of the anxious watchfulness that had haunted his eyes since his father died. The boarders were polite but distant, with one exception. Kyle Anderson, despite Mrs. Patterson's warnings about his devotion to work, began to linger a bit after meals. He'd ask Thomas about what he was playing with or compliment Natalie on the biscuits, or mention that the weather was changing. Small talk, nothing significant, but Natalie found herself listening for his footsteps and feeling disappointed on the nights he stayed at the ranch. It was 3 weeks after she'd started working at the boarding house when everything changed. Natalie was in the yard hanging laundry, Thomas playing with a wooden horse near her feet, when she heard horses approaching at speed. She looked up to see 3 riders dismounting in front of the boarding house with an urgency that sent alarm bells ringing through her mind. She recognized one as Ben Fletcher, another of the boarders, Mrs. Patterson. Ben was shouting, "We need help. There's been an accident." Natalie dropped the sheet she'd been hanging and ran toward the front of the house, Thomas forgotten in her panic. Mrs. Patterson was already at the door, and the men were supporting someone between them. Kyle Anderson, his face pale and twisted in pain, blood soaking through his shirt at the shoulder. "What happened?" Mrs. Patterson demanded, already moving into action. "Bull got loose, went crazy." Kyle got between it and one of the younger hands. Bull's horn caught his shoulder before we could rope it. Ben and another man were practically carrying Kyle now, and Natalie could see how much blood there was. "Bring him into the back bedroom." "Natalie, I need hot water, clean cloths, and my medical kit from the pantry. Move quickly." Natalie's nursing instincts, learned during her husband's final illness and refined through 5 years of caring for a child, kicked in. She ran to the kitchen, set water to boil, gathered clean cloths, and found Mrs. Patterson's medical kit, a battered leather bag that looked like it had seen decades of use. In the bedroom, Kyle was lying on the bed, conscious but breathing hard through clenched teeth. Mrs. Patterson was cutting away his blood-soaked shirt, revealing a deep gash that ran from his shoulder down his upper arm. It was bleeding heavily but didn't appear to have hit any major vessels. "This needs stitching," Mrs. Patterson said grimly. "Ben, go fetch Doc Morgan if he's sober." "If he's not, we'll manage without him. I can help," Natalie said, setting down the water and cloths. "I've done nursing before." Mrs. Patterson glanced at her, then nodded. "Good. Start cleaning the wound. Kyle, this is going to hurt." "Already does," Kyle managed through gritted teeth. His eyes found Natalie's, and she saw pain and something else in them, maybe embarrassment at being seen like this, vulnerable and bleeding. "Try to stay still," she said gently, wringing out a cloth in the hot water. She began cleaning the wound as carefully as she could, but there was no way to make it painless. Kyle's jaw clenched so hard she could hear his teeth grinding, but he didn't cry out. "You're doing well," she murmured, the same tone she'd used with Thomas when he scraped a knee. "Just breathe through it." Doc Morgan arrived 15 minutes later, reeking of whiskey but with steady enough hands. He examined the wound, nodded approvingly at Natalie's cleaning job, and proceeded to stitch Kyle's shoulder with quick, efficient movements. Kyle bore it stoically, though Natalie saw his free hand gripping the bed frame so hard his knuckles were white. When it was done and the wound was bandaged, Doc Morgan straightened up. "Keep it clean, change the dressing daily, and watch for signs of infection. He's lucky." An inch to the right and that horn would have shattered his collarbone. As it is, he'll need to keep that arm mostly immobile for at least 2 weeks. 2 weeks? Kyle sat up, or tried to, and immediately went pale. "I can't. The ranch needs me. We're bringing in cattle from the north pasture, and there's fence to mend, and you'll be no good to anyone if you tear those stitches or that wound goes septic," Doc Morgan said firmly. 2 weeks of light duty at minimum, Mr. Anderson. That's not a suggestion." Kyle looked like he wanted to argue, but Mrs. Patterson cut him off. "You'll stay here where we can look after you properly. No arguments. Natalie's got nursing experience, and I'll not have you riding off to that ranch and bleeding all over my clean linens because you're too stubborn to rest." After more protests that went nowhere, Kyle finally subsided into frustrated acceptance. The other ranch hands left to deal with the crisis at the AA, and Natalie found herself assigned as Kyle's primary caretaker, since Mrs. Patterson's arthritis made the stairs difficult. That evening she brought him supper on a tray. He was sitting up in bed, still pale but more alert, his injured arm in a sling Mrs. Patterson had fashioned. "I'm sorry to be such trouble," he said as she set the tray across his lap. "You're not trouble. You're injured and you need care. That's what we're here for." She poured him coffee from the pot she'd brought up. "Mrs. Patterson told me what you did, stepping between the bull and that young ranch hand. That was brave. That was my job. Miguel's only 17, barely been working cattle for a year. I couldn't let him get gored." "Still brave," Natalie insisted. She busied herself tidying the already tidy room, aware of his eyes following her movements. "Is there anything else you need? More pillows, another blanket?" "I'm fine, thank you, Mrs. Kendall." "Natalie is fine." Natalie then. "I have to ask, that boy in the yard, Thomas, he's yours?" She stiffened automatically, years of rejection making her defensive. "Yes, he's my son. He looks like a good kid. Been watching him play sometimes when I'm here. He's got a good imagination, always making up stories with those toys." Natalie relaxed slightly. "He does. He's had to entertain himself a lot. It hasn't been an easy couple of years for him." "Mrs. Patterson mentioned your husband passed. I'm sorry." "Thank you." She finished her unnecessary tidying and moved toward the door. "I'll come back for the tray later. Try to rest." "Natalie," she paused at the door, "thank you for helping today. You've got gentle hands for nursing. Your husband was lucky to have someone like you caring for him at the end." The words, meant kindly, brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "I'll check on you later," she managed, and fled before he could see her cry. Over the next few days, a strange intimacy developed between them. Natalie changed his bandages twice daily, brought his meals, and kept him company when Mrs. Patterson's other duties demanded her attention. Kyle turned out to be an easy patient despite his frustration at being bedridden. He was unfailingly polite, grateful for every small service, and surprisingly easy to talk to. She learned he'd been born in Texas, the youngest of 5 children, and that his father had been a ranch hand who died when Kyle was 12. She learned he'd worked his way up from nothing to foreman by the age of 26 through sheer determination and skill with cattle and horses. She learned he loved the land with a passion that was almost poetic when he described it. The way the grass looked in early morning light, the sound of cattle settling for the night, the vast emptiness of the Texas sky. In turn, he gently drew out her story. She told him about meeting James at a church social in Missouri, about their dreams of California and the farm they'd planned to buy. She told him about the wagon train, the fever that had swept through it, and the terrible week watching James slip away while knowing she could do nothing to save him. She told him about the rejections, the men who'd looked at Thomas like he was an obstacle rather than a gift. They were fools, Kyle said flatly. It was the 5th day of his recovery, and he was sitting in a chair by the window rather than in bed, a significant improvement. Any man would be lucky to have you, and that boy is no burden. He's bright, well-mannered, and clearly loves you. Those should be selling points, not drawbacks. Not everyone sees it that way. Most men want to start fresh, have their own children, build their own family. They don't want the reminder of another man's love. Kyle was quiet for a long moment. I think that's short-sighted. Life doesn't give us neat, fresh starts. We're all carrying something, some loss or regret or scar. A man worth his salt understands that and doesn't hold it against someone. He looked at her directly, those storm-colored eyes intense. You're a good mother, Natalie. You're a hard worker. You're kind and patient and strong. Any man who can't see past your circumstances to the woman you are is missing out on something extraordinary. Natalie felt heat rising in her cheeks. That's kind of you to say. It's not kindness, it's truth. He shifted in his chair, wincing slightly at the pull on his shoulder. I've watched you with Thomas the way you are with him. Patient even when you're tired, always making sure he feels safe and loved. That's not common. And I've watched you work, how you never complain even though I know Mrs. Patterson drives you hard. You've got backbone, Natalie Kendall. I do what needs doing, that's all. That's more than most people manage. Their eyes met and held, and something passed between them, an understanding or recognition that made Natalie's heart beat faster. She looked away first, flustered in a way she hadn't felt since James had courted her all those years ago. I should let you rest, she said, standing abruptly. Natalie. She paused at the door, as had become their pattern. Would you bring Thomas up sometime? I'd like to meet him properly. The request surprised her. If you'd like. He's been curious about the man staying in the back bedroom. That evening, after supper was cleared and the dishes were done, Natalie brought Thomas upstairs. The boy was shy at first, hiding behind her skirts, but Kyle had a natural ease with children that soon drew him out. Your mama tells me you like horses, Kyle said, and Thomas nodded. I work with horses every day at my ranch. Maybe sometime, if your mama agrees, I could take you out to see them. Thomas's eyes went wide. Real horses, to ride. Well, you might be a bit small for riding just yet, but you could meet them, learn how to brush them and feed them. Would you like that? Yes, sir. Thomas was practically bouncing now. Mama, can I? Natalie felt a pang of something complicated, gratitude that someone was being kind to her son, but also fear. Fear that Thomas would get attached, that she would get attached, and that when Kyle healed and went back to his regular life, they'd be left with another loss to bear. We'll see, she said, the universal mother's answer for maybe no. But Kyle caught her eye over Thomas's head, and his slight smile said he understood her hesitation. After Thomas went to bed that night, Natalie found herself unable to sleep. She kept replaying Kyle's words, his kindness to her son, the way his eyes had looked at her like she was worth something beyond her labor. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her that way. It felt dangerous and thrilling and terrifying all at once. Don't be a fool, she whispered to herself in the darkness. He's just being kind because you're caring for him. Once he's healed, he'll forget all about you. But she didn't quite believe it. Kyle's recovery progressed well, though more slowly than he would have liked. By the end of the second week, he was moving around the boarding house, helping with small tasks despite Mrs. Patterson's scolding. He chopped kindling one-handed. entertained Thomas with stories about cattle drives and wild Mustangs, and continued to seek out Natalie's company at every opportunity. It was Thomas, in his childish innocence, who forced the issue into the open. They were in the yard, Natalie hanging laundry while Kyle and Thomas played with the wooden toys. The boy had been chattering about a game he'd invented when he suddenly stopped and looked up at Kyle with complete seriousness. "Mr. Kyle, are you going to marry my mama?" Natalie nearly dropped the shirt she was hanging. "Thomas, that's not an appropriate question." But Kyle didn't seem flustered. He looked at Thomas thoughtfully. "Would you like me to?" "Yes," Thomas said simply. "You're nice to Mama. The other men who wanted to marry her weren't nice. They looked at me like I was bad." "You're not bad," Kyle said firmly. "You're a good boy, and anyone who couldn't see that is the one with the problem, not you." "So will you marry her?" Thomas pressed, with the persistence only a 5-year-old could manage. Kyle glanced at Natalie, and she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. "Your mama and I would need to talk about that. Marriage is a big decision. But you like her, right? And she likes you, I can tell." "Thomas, that's enough," Natalie said, mortified. "Go inside and see if Mrs. Patterson needs help with anything." Thomas, sensing he'd crossed a line, scampered off. Natalie stood frozen by the clothesline, unable to look at Kyle. "Out of the mouths of children," Kyle said quietly. He crossed the yard to stand near her, close enough that she could smell horse and leather and something uniquely him. "He's not wrong, you know." "About what?" Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "About me liking you. I do. More than like, if I'm being honest." Now she did look at him, searching his face for signs of pity or obligation or anything other than sincerity. "Kyle, you don't have to say that. I know Thomas put you in an awkward position." "Thomas didn't make me feel anything I wasn't already feeling." "Natalie, these past 2 weeks, getting to know you, seeing how you are with your son, how you work yourself to exhaustion to provide for him, how you're kind even when you're tired and patient even when you're worried. I've never met anyone like you. I'm sure you've met plenty of women without the complication of a child. I've met women, yes, but none of them were you." He reached out with his good hand and gently touched her arm, the contact sending sparks through her. "I know you've been hurt. I know men have rejected you and Thomas, and that's made you cautious. I understand that. But I need you to understand something too. When I look at you, I don't see complications or baggage or another man's child. I see a woman I admire. I see strength and grace and beauty. And when I look at Thomas, I see a boy who needs a father and deserves one who will love him not despite who he is, but because of it." Tears were streaming down Natalie's face now. "You barely know us. I know enough. I know what matters." His hand moved from her arm to her face, cupping her cheek with a gentleness that made her want to sob. "I'm not saying we have to rush into anything. I'm not saying it would be easy, but I am saying that I want to try. I want to court you properly, Natalie Kendall. I want to take you and Thomas out to the ranch. I want to spend my evenings talking with you instead of sitting alone in my room. I want to see if what I think is building between us is real. And if it is," she hardly dared to ask, "what then? Then I marry you if you'll have me. I give Thomas a father and a home. I give you a partner instead of a provider. I give us all a chance at the family we deserve. You'd really take us both, not just me, but Thomas too." "Two hearts to love instead of one," Kyle said softly. "Natalie, that boy is part of you. I couldn't separate you from him even if I wanted to, which I don't. If I'm courting you, I'm courting the package deal, and I'm grateful for it." She couldn't help it. She started crying in earnest, years of rejection and fear and loneliness pouring out. Kyle pulled her against his chest, awkward with one arm still tender, but his embrace was warm and solid and real. "I'm scared," she admitted into his shirt. I'm scared to hope again. Hope is terrifying, he agreed, but the alternative is worse. Give me a chance, Natalie. Let me prove that not all men are fools. She pulled back enough to look up at him. You're supposed to be resting and healing, not proposing courtship. I'm healed enough for the important things. His smile was crooked and utterly charming. Say yes. Let me court you. Let me show Thomas the horses. Let me try to earn a place in your life. The sensible part of her brain, the part that had been protecting her heart for 2 years, screamed caution. But the rest of her, the part that was tired of being alone and scared and constantly braced for rejection, whispered yes. All right, she said. Yes, you can court me, us. But Kyle, if you change your mind, if you realize it's too much, please tell me honestly. Don't let us get more attached and then. He silenced her with a kiss. It was gentle and careful, mindful of his injury and their very public location, but it was real and warm and full of promise. When he pulled back, his eyes were bright. I'm not changing my mind, he said firmly. Now, let's go tell Thomas before he pesters Mrs. Patterson to death, asking what we're talking about. Thomas's joy when they explained that Mr. Kyle would be spending more time with them, would be taking them places and getting to know them better, was incandescent. He hugged Kyle's legs so hard the man nearly toppled, and then hugged Natalie, and then ran in circles around the yard whooping with delight. Mrs. Patterson, watching from the kitchen window, just shook her head with a knowing smile. The courtship that followed was unlike anything Natalie had experienced, even with James. Kyle approached it with the same determination he brought to ranching, which meant he was thorough, attentive, and unwavering. Once Doc Morgan cleared him to return to light work, he began dividing his time between the ranch and town more deliberately. He'd handle the morning work at the AA, ride into town for lunch, spend the afternoon either at the ranch or helping with odd jobs around Pecos, and then return for supper at the boarding house. He carved out time for all of them. He'd take Thomas to see the horses at the livery stable, teaching the boy how to approach them safely, how to read their moods, how to offer an apple on a flat palm. He'd sit with Natalie on the boarding house porch after Thomas went to bed, talking about everything and nothing, sharing stories and dreams and comfortable silences. And on Sundays, after church, he'd take them both out to the AA ranch. The ranch was everything Kyle had described and more. Vast stretches of land dotted with cattle, the ranch house itself a sturdy structure built to withstand Texas weather, corrals full of horses, and a sky so big it made Natalie feel simultaneously insignificant and part of something eternal. Thomas fell in love with the ranch immediately. Kyle let him help with small tasks, collecting eggs from the chickens, brushing the gentler horses, ringing the bell for the ranch hand's dinner. The boy blossomed under the attention, growing more confident and outgoing with each visit. But it was the quiet moments that Natalie treasured most. Kyle would saddle 2 horses, put Thomas on the gentler one while he led it, and ride out with Natalie to show her the land. He'd point out where the best water sources were, explain the different grasses and how they sustain the cattle, share his vision for expanding the herd and improving the breed. The owner trusts me to run this place as I see fit, Kyle explained one afternoon as they sat on a rise overlooking the main pasture. Thomas was napping under a cottonwood tree nearby, worn out from his morning adventures. He inherited it from his father but has business interests back east. He's told me if I can make it profitable, he'll sell me a stake in it. That's my goal, to own part of this land to build something lasting. It's a good goal, Natalie said. You've already built something impressive. I want to build more. I want to build a home, Natalie. Not just a house, but a real home with a family. I want to hear children's laughter in the yard and smell baking bread in the kitchen. I want someone to share the good days and the hard ones with. I want what I never had growing up, stability and love and permanence. She understood because she wanted the same thing. The ranch already felt more like home than anywhere she'd been since James died. She could picture Thomas growing up here, learning to ride and rope and work cattle. She could picture more children, brothers and sisters for Thomas to play with. She could picture growing old here with Kyle, watching the seasons change and the land endure. "How long do you think a proper courtship should last?" Kyle asked, his tone carefully casual. Natalie smiled. "Traditionally, at least several months, maybe a year. That seems excessive. Most people would say it's prudent. Most people haven't spent 2 weeks having someone nurse them back to health, seeing them at their worst, and still wanting to see them at their best." He took her hand, intertwining their fingers. "I know what I want, Natalie. I'm not a man who second-guesses himself. I want to marry you. I want to adopt Thomas legally, give him my name and everything that comes with it. I want to start our life together, not in some distant future, but soon." Her heart was racing. Define soon. End of October. That's 6 weeks away. Gives you time to be sure of me, gives me time to prove myself, but doesn't make us wait unnecessarily. He turned to face her fully. "Natalie Kendall, I know this is fast. I know by all conventional standards we should wait longer, but life is uncertain. I learned that when my father died. I learned it again watching you struggle as a widow with a child to protect. We don't get guarantees of tomorrow, so why waste the todays we have?" She thought about the past 2 years, the loneliness and struggle and constant uncertainty. She thought about the men who'd rejected her, and how none of them had ever made her feel the way Kyle did, safe and valued and desired all at once. She thought about Thomas's happiness, the way he'd started calling Kyle sir, with the kind of respect that hinted at deeper affection. 6 weeks, she repeated. That would make it late October, early November at the latest. Is that a yes? That's a yes to continuing this courtship with marriage as the clear goal. But Kyle, I need something from you too, anything. Promise me that you'll be honest. If you have doubts, if this gets hard, if Thomas becomes too much or I'm not what you expected, you'll tell me. I can handle truth. I can't handle being left again without understanding why." His expression turned fierce. "I'm not leaving you. Not now, not ever. And Thomas is never too much. He's a gift, Natalie. A ready-made son who I already care about deeply. But I promise, I'll always be honest with you. That's what marriage should be, honesty and partnership and working through the hard things together." They sealed it with a kiss, deeper and more passionate than before, and when they finally pulled apart, Thomas was awake and watching them with a delighted grin. "Are you getting married now?" he called out. "Soon," Kyle called back. "Is that all right with you?" Thomas scrambled to his feet and ran over, throwing himself at both of them. "Yes, can I call you Papa?" Kyle's eyes went suspiciously bright. "I'd be honored if you called me Papa." "Papa," Thomas tested the word, then said it again with more confidence. "Papa, can I have a brother or sister?" Natalie felt her face flame, but Kyle just laughed. "Maybe someday if your mama agrees and God wills it. But for now you'll have me and your mama and a whole ranch to explore. Is that enough?" "Yes." Thomas was off again, running through the grass, shouting, "I have a papa." To the sky and cattle and anyone who might hear, Kyle pulled Natalie close, mindful of their audience but unable to resist holding her. 6 weeks, he murmured. "I don't know how I'll survive 6 weeks of waiting." "You survived a bull goring, you can survive a courtship." The bull was less terrifying than the thought of you changing your mind. She looked up at him, this man who'd appeared in her life like an answer to prayers she'd been afraid to voice. "I'm not changing my mind. You're stuck with us now, Kyle Anderson. Best news I've heard all year." The next 6 weeks passed in a blur of preparation and growing anticipation. Natalie continued working for Mrs. Patterson, but now with the understanding that it was temporary, that soon she'd be the lady of the Double Ranch. The old woman was thrilled, declaring that she'd known from the start that Kyle and Natalie were meant for each other. A man needs a good woman, and a good woman needs a man who appreciates her, Mrs. Patterson pronounced. You two fit like a hand in a glove. Kyle approached the marriage with characteristic thoroughness. He made arrangements to legally adopt Thomas, working with a lawyer in Pecos to draw up the papers. He bought lumber and hired help to add an extra bedroom to the ranch house so Thomas would have his own space. He opened an account at the general store under Natalie's name, insisting she order whatever she needed for the house and her own wardrobe without worrying about the cost. "You've been making do and mending for too long," he said when she protested the extravagance. "Let me provide for you. Let me give you nice things. It makes me happy to see you have what you need." They decided on a simple wedding ceremony to be held at the church in Pecos with just a few witnesses. Natalie sewed herself a new dress, a soft blue cotton that brought out her eyes, and Kyle bought a new suit that made him look almost uncomfortable in its formality. Thomas would have a new outfit too, and he practiced walking solemnly down the aisle of the church until he could do it without running. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. 3 weeks before the wedding, a woman arrived in Pecos who claimed to be Kyle's former sweetheart. Her name was Charlotte, and she was beautiful in a delicate, china doll way that made Natalie feel rough and plain by comparison. Charlotte made it known that she and Kyle had an understanding years ago, before she'd moved east to live with relatives, and that she'd returned expecting to find him waiting for her. Natalie heard about Charlotte from one of the other boarders before she heard about her from Kyle, and the lapse in communication stung. When Kyle came to town that evening, she met him at the door with Thomas already in bed and her expression carefully neutral. "We need to talk," she said. Kyle immediately looked wary. "About what?" "About Charlotte Whitmore. About why I had to hear from Ben Fletcher that your former sweetheart is in town expecting you to marry her instead of me." He closed his eyes briefly. "I was going to tell you tonight. I wanted to handle it first, make sure she understood there was nothing between us anymore, but she's been difficult to pin down." "How serious were you?" "With her. Serious enough that I asked her father's permission to court her 5 years ago. But she made it clear that Texas was too rough for her, that she wanted city life and refinement. She left for Boston, and I never heard from her again. No letters, no promises to return, nothing. I moved on. I built my life. And now she shows up acting like no time has passed, and I should just fall at her feet in gratitude." "Did you love her?" Kyle was quiet for a moment. "I thought I did. But now, knowing you, I realize what I felt for Charlotte was infatuation. She was pretty and refined, everything I thought I wanted. But she didn't love Texas, didn't love the ranch, didn't love the life I was building. She loved the idea of me maybe, but not the reality. You're different. You see me as I am, dirt under my fingernails and all, and you don't want me to be anything else. That's real, Natalie. What Charlotte and I had was a youthful fantasy." She wanted to believe him. She did believe him, mostly. But the old fears crept in, the years of rejection whispering that maybe Charlotte represented what Kyle really wanted. A woman without complications, without another man's child, without the hard edges life had carved into Natalie. "She doesn't have a son," Natalie said quietly. "She can give you a fresh start." Kyle crossed to her in 2 strides, taking her face in both hands and forcing her to look at him. "Listen to me. I don't want a fresh start. I want you. I want Thomas. I want the life we're building together. Charlotte can offer me nothing I want because what I want is standing right in front of me. But what if? No what-ifs. Natalie, you have to trust this. Trust me. I'm going to talk to Charlotte tomorrow, make it crystal clear that I'm marrying you and nothing she says or does will change that. But I need you to believe in us. Can you do that? She searched his face, looking for doubt or hesitation, and found only fierce determination and something that looked a lot like love. I'm trying. It's hard. I know, but we'll get through hard things together, remember. That's the promise we're making. He pulled her into his arms and she let herself lean into his strength. I love you, Natalie. I should have said it before now. I love you and I love Thomas, and I'm going to marry you in 3 weeks if I have to fight off every rival who appears between now and then. You love me. She pulled back to see his face. Completely, absolutely, without reservation, he smiled. I thought it was obvious. I thought it was hope. Or wishful thinking. It's real, do you? Can you love me back? Or is it too soon? She thought about the question seriously. What she felt for Kyle was different from what she'd felt for James. That had been young love, sweet and uncomplicated. This was deeper, forged in struggle and built on genuine understanding. It was the love of someone who'd been broken and learned how to heal, who knew the value of partnership and chose it deliberately. I love you, she said, and meant it with everything in her. I think I started falling for you when you said Thomas was bright and well-mannered instead of an obstacle. You saw value where others saw burden, and that opened something in my heart I'd thought was closed forever. His kiss was answer and promise and celebration all at once. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Kyle pressed his forehead to hers. 3 more weeks, he groaned. It's going to kill me. We'll survive. We're good at surviving. The next day, Kyle had his confrontation with Charlotte. Natalie heard about it secondhand from Mrs. Patterson, who heard it from the milliner, who heard it from her assistant, who witnessed the whole thing. Apparently Charlotte had tried tears, then anger, then pleading, and Kyle had remained unmoved. He told her in plain terms that he was marrying Natalie, that he'd never promised Charlotte anything permanent, and that she needed to accept his decision and move on. Charlotte left Pecos 2 days later, and Natalie felt guilty for the relief that flooded through her. She knew it wasn't charitable to be glad of another woman's heartbreak, but she couldn't help it. This happiness with Kyle was too precious, too hard-won, to risk losing. The week before the wedding, Kyle moved most of his belongings out to the ranch permanently. He'd still stay at the boarding house occasionally when work demanded it, but the ranch house was being prepared as their home. Natalie and Thomas went out to see the improvements he'd made, and she found herself tearing up at the care he'd taken. The bedroom he'd added for Thomas was painted a cheerful yellow, with a real bed frame and a chest for clothes and toys. The main bedroom had new curtains that Natalie had sewn from fabric Kyle insisted on buying. The kitchen had been stocked with supplies, the pantry filled with staples, and there was even a rocking chair on the porch that Kyle said he'd imagined her sitting in while he came home from a long day's work. It's perfect, she whispered, standing in the main room and turning in a slow circle. Kyle, it's more than I ever dreamed. It's just the beginning. We'll add more as we need it, maybe another bedroom or 2 if we're blessed with more children, maybe a bigger barn. The land can support it all. He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. Can you see it? Our life here. Yes. She leaned back against him, feeling safe and cherished. I can see it clearly. Thomas had already claimed his room, running back and forth between it and the kitchen, shouting about how big it was and how he could put all his toys in the chest and still have room. His joy was infectious, and Natalie found herself laughing more in those few hours than she had in months. They had supper at the ranch that night, just the 3 of them, and it felt like a rehearsal for the life to come. Kyle said grace, thanking God for bringing them together and asking blessing on their future. They ate the simple meal Natalie had prepared, and afterwards Thomas fell asleep on the settee, exhausted from exploration and excitement. "He's already home here," Kyle observed, covering the boy with a blanket. "Look how peaceful he is. He's never had stability like this. Even before James died, we were always on the move, always temporary. This is the first place he's been able to put down roots. Then we'll make sure those roots grow deep. This is his home now, Natalie. Yours too. Forever, if I have any say in it." "Forever sounds good," she agreed and sealed it with a kiss. The wedding day arrived with perfect autumn weather. October in West Texas could be unpredictable, but that day dawned clear and mild, with a breeze that carried the scent of dry grass and possibility. Natalie dressed carefully in her new blue dress, pinning up her hair with more care than usual. Mrs. Patterson helped, chattering about weddings and giving advice that ranged from practical to scandalous. Thomas wore his new clothes with pride, his hair slicked down and his face shining from scrubbing. He carried the rings, 2 simple gold bands that Kyle had ordered from a jeweler in Fort Worth, with the solemnity of someone given a sacred trust. The church was small but full. Mrs. Patterson was there, along with all the boarders. Doc Morgan came, sober and dressed in a suit that had seen better days. The ranch hands from the double filled several pews, and various townspeople who'd come to know Natalie through her work attended as well. It wasn't the tiny ceremony they'd planned, but seeing the community support brought tears to Natalie's eyes. Kyle stood at the altar looking uncomfortable in his new suit, but impossibly handsome. His eyes found hers as she entered on Mrs. Patterson's arm, since there was no father or brother to give her away, and his expression held such love and wonder that Natalie had to blink back tears. The ceremony itself was simple. The circuit preacher, a man who visited Pecos once a month, led them through the traditional vows. But when it came time for personal promises, Kyle departed from the script. "Natalie," he said, his voice carrying through the small church, "I promise to love you and honor you all the days of my life. I promise to be a father to Thomas, to raise him as my own and give him everything I have to give. I promise to build a home with you, not just a house but a refuge and a place of joy. I promise to be your partner in all things, to share the work and the rewards, the struggles and the triumphs. I promise to never make you doubt your worth or your place in my life. You are my choice, today and every day forward." Natalie's voice shook as she made her own promises. "Kyle, I promise to love you with everything I have. I promise to be your partner in building the life we both dream of. I promise to trust in your love even when fear whispers doubts. I promise to honor the gift you're giving Thomas by being his father, and to build a family with you that's based on love and respect and honesty. You've given me hope when I thought I had none left, and I promise to never take that gift for granted." When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Kyle's kiss was gentle and reverent, mindful of their audience but full of promise for later. Thomas cheered, and the congregation laughed, and for the first time in 2 years, Natalie felt completely, perfectly happy. The celebration afterwards was held at the boarding house, with Mrs. Patterson insisting on hosting a wedding supper. She'd outdone herself, preparing a feast that must have taken days. There was roasted chicken and beef, fresh bread, 3 kinds of preserves, potatoes and beans and squash, and a cake that she'd somehow managed to frost with white icing despite the heat. They ate and laughed and accepted congratulations from everyone. Doc Morgan gave a rambling toast about love and stubbornness, and how sometimes the best things came from unexpected places. Ben Fletcher sang a bawdy song that made Natalie blush and Kyle laugh. And through it all, Thomas was passed from person to person, soaking up attention and proudly telling everyone that Kyle was his papa now, not just Mr. As the sun set and people began drifting home, Kyle and Natalie slipped away. They'd arranged for Thomas to spend the night with Mrs. Patterson, giving them privacy for their first night as husband and wife. Kyle had a wagon waiting, loaded with Natalie's few possessions and his own belongings from the boarding house. The ride out to the ranch was quiet, both of them tired from the day but content. Kyle drove with one hand, the other holding Natalie's, and she leaned against his shoulder watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Happy?" he asked softly. "More than I knew how to hope for," she replied honestly. "You've given me everything, Kyle. You've given me more. A wife, a son, a reason to build something beyond just work. I'm the lucky one here, Natalie Anderson." Natalie Anderson. Her new name, her new identity, her new life. She tested it silently and found it fit perfectly. The ranch house was dark when they arrived, but Kyle had left lamps ready to light. He lifted Natalie down from the wagon with unnecessary ceremony, making her laugh, and then surprised her by sweeping her up into his arms. "I know it's traditional to carry you over the threshold," he said, "but I want to do it right. This is your home now, Natalie, our home." He carried her through the door and set her down gently in the main room. For a moment they just stood there, looking at each other in the lamplight, the weight of the commitment they'd made settling over them. "I'm nervous," Natalie admitted. "Isn't that silly? I've been married before, I've had a child, but I'm nervous." "I'm nervous too," Kyle confessed. "I want everything to be right for you. I want to make you happy." "You already do." She stepped closer, reaching up to touch his face. "Just by being you, by choosing us, you make me happy." His kiss was deeper than before, full of desire but also tenderness. He took his time, learning her responses, showing her without words how much she meant to him. When he finally lifted her in his arms again and carried her to their bedroom, Natalie felt no more nervousness, only anticipation and love. Their wedding night was everything it should be, a blend of passion and laughter and tender moments that spoke of the partnership they were building. Kyle was patient and attentive, making sure Natalie felt cherished and desired. And when they finally fell asleep tangled together in the pre-dawn hours, both felt the deep satisfaction of having found their home in each other. The months that followed established the rhythm of their new life together. Kyle worked the ranch with the help of his hands, and Natalie managed the household, learning the ins and outs of running a ranch house. Thomas thrived, growing strong and confident under Kyle's patient teaching. He learned to ride a gentle horse, to help with feeding the chickens and gathering eggs, to recognize different cattle brands and understand the work of the ranch. But it wasn't all easy. The drought that had plagued the region worsened through the fall and into winter. Water sources dried up, and Kyle had to drive the cattle further to find grazing. Money got tight as feed costs rose and cattle prices fell. There were nights when Kyle came home exhausted and discouraged, worried about losing cattle or being unable to pay the ranch hands. Through it all, Natalie stood beside him. She stretched their food budget, learning to make meals from next to nothing. She helped with ranch work when needed, riding out to check on watering holes or helping with branding despite Kyle's protests that it was too hard for her. She listened when he needed to talk and gave him space when he needed to think. She was partner and helpmeet in the truest sense. One particularly hard night in January, 5 months after their wedding, Kyle came home after 3 days away dealing with a crisis at the North Pasture. He was filthy, exhausted, and radiating frustration. Natalie took one look at him, sent Thomas to play in his room, and drew a hot bath. "You're going to sit and soak while I heat up supper," she said firmly. "Then you're going to eat, and then you're going to tell me what's wrong, and we're going to figure it out together." He was too tired to argue. After his bath and a meal, he sat at the kitchen table and laid out the problem. They were losing cattle to dehydration. The bank was pressuring him about the ranch's loan, and the owner back east was making noises about selling the place to someone else if profits didn't improve. "I'm failing," Kyle said, his voice raw. "I promised you a home, a stable future, and I'm failing." "You're not failing. You're facing a crisis that's affecting every ranch in Texas. That's not the same thing." Natalie sat across from him, taking his hands. "What do we need to survive this? A miracle, or rain, or both? What can we control? We can't make it rain, but what can we actually do?" Together they strategized. They'd sell some cattle at a loss rather than lose them to dehydration. They'd cut expenses to the bone. Natalie would take in sewing and laundry from town to bring in extra money. Kyle would approach the bank about restructuring the loan. They'd write to the owner and propose that Kyle buy a larger stake in the ranch, betting on his own ability to turn it around. It was a plan born of desperation, but executed with determination. Through February and March, they worked themselves to exhaustion. Natalie sewed late into the night after Thomas was asleep, her fingers cramping from the repetitive motion. Kyle negotiated with the bank, sold cattle, and worked dawn to dusk, keeping the remaining herd alive. And then, in early April, the rains came. It started as a drizzle that made Thomas dance in the yard with delight. Within hours, it became a steady rain, the kind that soaked deep into the parched earth. It rained for 3 days straight, filling the water holes, turning the grass green, giving the cattle and the land and the people desperate need of relief. Kyle stood on the porch watching it fall, and Natalie came to stand beside him. They'd both been so focused on survival that they hadn't had time for much else, but now, in this moment of reprieve, they could breathe. "We made it," Kyle said, his voice full of wonder. "We actually made it through." "We made it together," Natalie corrected. "That's what matters." He pulled her close, and they stood there in the cool, rain-washed air, feeling the tension of the past months finally ease. The ranch recovered through the spring. The grass came back thick and green, and the cattle fattened on good grazing. Kyle was able to renegotiate with the owner, buying a 40% stake in the ranch with money borrowed against future profits. It was a risk, but it gave him real ownership and a stronger position to weather future crises. By summer, they were stable again, and Natalie discovered she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks but waited to be sure before telling Kyle. When she finally did, over supper one evening with Thomas already asleep, his reaction was everything she'd hoped for: a baby. He looked stunned, then elated, then worried, all in quick succession. "Are you well? Do you need Doc Morgan? Should you be resting more?" She laughed at his panic. "I'm fine. It's early yet, probably due sometime in late January or early February, but yes, we're going to have a baby." Kyle came around the table and pulled her up into his arms, spinning her around until she squeaked in protest. "We're having a baby. Thomas is getting a brother or sister. Kyle, put me down before you make me dizzy." He set her down carefully, then immediately dropped to his knees and pressed his ear to her still flat stomach. "Hello in there," he said solemnly. "This is your papa. I'm going to love you so much." Natalie ran her fingers through his hair, overcome with emotion. This baby would be theirs together, a new life created from their love. But she noticed Kyle's careful word choice, his awareness that this baby would have two parents from the start, unlike Thomas. "Kyle, you know Thomas is just as much yours, right? You don't have to differentiate." He looked up at her, his eyes serious. "I know. And I don't, not in my heart. But I want to make sure Thomas knows that too, that this baby doesn't change how I feel about him. He's my son in every way that matters. This new baby will be his full sibling, not half anything." "You're a good father," she said softly. "The best father." They told Thomas the next morning, and his reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. "A baby? Can I teach it to ride horses? Can I show it my room? When will it be here?" They explained that babies took time to grow, and that the baby would be tiny and helpless at first. But Thomas was undeterred in his excitement. For months afterward, he talked to Natalie's growing belly, telling the baby about the ranch and the horses and everything they'd do together when it was born. The pregnancy progressed well through the summer and fall. Natalie continued her work, though Kyle became increasingly protective, insisting she rest more and not lift heavy things. By winter she was quite round, moving slowly and carefully, and Kyle treated her like she was made of glass. "I'm having a baby, not dying," she protested when he tried to prevent her from doing laundry. "I know, but humor me. I can't help worrying. You're sweet, but I'm tougher than you think." "I know how tough you are. You've proven that over and over. Just let me take care of you, all right?" "It makes me feel useful." How could she argue with that? So she let him fuss and fret, knowing it came from love. The baby arrived on a cold February night in 1879, after a labor that lasted through the day and into darkness. Mrs. Patterson came to help, having promised months ago that she'd attend the birth. She'd delivered dozens of babies in her lifetime and moved through the process with calm efficiency that kept Natalie from panicking. Kyle paced the kitchen, kept Thomas occupied and out of the way, and jumped every time he heard a sound from the bedroom. When the baby's first cry finally split the air, he nearly knocked over a chair in his haste to get to the door, only to be blocked by Mrs. Patterson. "Give us a moment to clean them both up," she said, but she was smiling. "You have a daughter, Kyle, a healthy, beautiful daughter. A daughter." Kyle felt something in his chest expand painfully. A daughter who would have his name from birth, who would never doubt her place in his heart or his family. But the joy was immediately tempered by concern. "Natalie is tired but well. She did beautifully. Now give us 5 minutes and then you can come meet your daughter properly." Those 5 minutes felt like 5 hours. When Mrs. Patterson finally opened the door, Kyle entered to find Natalie propped up on pillows, looking exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket Natalie had sewn months ago. "Meet your daughter," Natalie said softly, and carefully placed the baby in Kyle's arms. She was impossibly tiny, with a shock of dark hair and a face red from crying. As Kyle held her, she opened her eyes and seemed to look right at him, and he felt himself falling utterly and completely in love. "She's perfect," he breathed. "Absolutely perfect. What should we name her?" They discussed names, of course, but couldn't decide between several they both liked. Now, looking at his daughter, one felt right. "Catherine," Natalie said, clearly thinking the same thing. "Catherine Ann Anderson." "Catherine," Kyle repeated, testing the name. "Katie for short. Welcome to the world, Katie." He sat on the edge of the bed, and they admired their daughter together, pointing out her tiny fingers and perfect toes. After a few minutes, Mrs. Patterson brought Thomas in to meet his new sister. Thomas approached cautiously, eyes wide. "She's really small." "You were this small once," Natalie assured him. "She'll grow, and then you'll teach her everything you know about the ranch. Can I hold her?" Kyle carefully transferred the baby to Thomas's arms, supporting him to make sure he didn't drop his precious burden. Thomas stared at his sister with wonder, and when Katie wrapped her tiny hand around his finger, he looked up with tears in his eyes. "She likes me," he whispered. "Of course she does," Kyle said, his own voice thick with emotion. "You're her big brother. She's going to think you're the most amazing person in the world." The picture they made, all together there in the lamplight, was everything Kyle had dreamed of and more. His wife, tired but beautiful. His son, now 7 and growing tall, holding his infant daughter with careful pride. His daughter, new to the world but already surrounded by love. "Thank you," he said to Natalie, and she knew he meant for everything, for taking a chance on him, for building this family, for giving him a life worth living. "Thank you," she replied, equally meaning for everything he'd given her, for seeing value in her and Thomas, for being the partner and father and husband she'd needed. Mrs. Patterson shooed everyone out after a while, insisting Natalie needed rest. Kyle took Thomas to bed, tucking him in and answering endless questions about babies until the boy finally fell asleep mid-sentence. When Kyle returned to his own bedroom, Natalie was nursing Katie, the baby's tiny face blissful as she fed. He undressed quietly and slid into bed beside them, watching the intimate scene with contentment. "I never imagined this," Natalie said softly. "When I was rejected for having Thomas, when men looked at us like we were too much trouble, I never imagined finding someone who would give us this." "Two hearts to love instead of one," Kyle quoted back his own words from that day in the boarding house yard, a lifetime ago. "That's what I said, and I meant it. Thomas and Katie, they're both mine, both precious, both exactly what I wanted even when I didn't know to want it." "We're lucky," Natalie said. "So incredibly lucky to have found each other. Not luck, grace, providence, fate. Whatever you want to call it, we were meant to be, Natalie. You and me and our family." Katie finished nursing and fell asleep, milk-drunk and content. Kyle took her gently and laid her in the cradle he'd built, then returned to bed and pulled Natalie into his arms. "I love you," he said, as he did every night. "I love you and Thomas and Katie and this life we've built." "I love you too," she replied, as she always did. "Forever." They fell asleep tangled together, and in the morning their family began the first day of their new normal. The years that followed were full and rich and exactly what they'd both needed. The ranch prospered as Kyle proved his worth to the owner, eventually buying full ownership when the man decided to liquidate his Western holdings entirely. Thomas grew into a capable young man who loved the ranch as much as Kyle did, showing promise as a natural cowboy and cattleman. Katie grew from infant to toddler to child, bright and fearless, with her father wrapped completely around her tiny finger. When Katie was 3, another baby arrived, a son they named Joshua. 2 years after that came another daughter, Sarah. The ranch house expanded with the family, rooms added as needed, filled with laughter and noise and the beautiful chaos of children. But through all the additions and changes, Kyle never treated Thomas any differently than his other children. He was scrupulous about ensuring the boy knew he was equally loved, equally valued, equally his son. When Thomas turned 15, Kyle formally adopted him with the judge in Pecos, making legal what had always been true in their hearts. Thomas Anderson, no longer Kendall, completely part of the family that had claimed him. On a warm evening in the spring of 1887, Kyle and Natalie sat on the porch watching their children play in the yard. Thomas was 18 now, tall and strong, teaching 9-year-old Katie how to throw a rope. Joshua, 6, and Sarah, 4, were chasing chickens with more enthusiasm than success. "Can you believe it's been 10 years?" Natalie asked, leaning against Kyle's shoulder. 10 years since we married." "Best 10 years of my life," Kyle said immediately. "Though I have to admit, I never imagined having 4 children. You said you wanted to hear children's laughter in the yard. You certainly got your wish." "I did." He pulled her closer. "I got everything I wished for and more. A family, a home, a partnership with someone I love more now than I did the day I married her. You're sentimental tonight. I'm grateful tonight. I was thinking about that day Thomas asked me if I was going to marry you. If he hadn't pushed the issue, I might have taken longer to work up the courage. You'd have gotten there eventually. You're not a man who hesitates once he knows what he wants. True, but I'm still grateful to him for speeding up the process. Kyle watched Thomas help Katie adjust her grip on the rope. He's a good man. You raised him well before I came along. We finished raising him together. That's what matters. Thomas looked up, caught them watching, and grinned. You two getting all mushy again, maybe, Kyle called back. Come get mushy yourself when you're old and married. Not happening anytime soon, Thomas laughed. I've got too much work to do. Right, Katie? Katie stuck her tongue out at her oldest brother but was smiling. The easy affection between the siblings was one of Natalie's greatest joys. As the sun set and the children were finally corralled inside for supper, Kyle took a moment alone with Natalie on the porch. I want to make sure you know something, he said seriously. Everything we have, everything we've built, it's because you took a chance on a cowboy who fell for you while you were nursing him back to health. You could have said no when I asked to court you. You could have decided I was just another rejection waiting to happen. But you were brave enough to hope, and that bravery gave us this life. Natalie felt tears prick her eyes. You were brave too. You looked at a widow with a child and saw possibility instead of burden. You gave us a home when we had nothing. You loved Thomas when others had rejected him. That took courage, Kyle. We were brave together, he said, and kissed her, soft and sweet. A kiss that tasted of 10 years of partnership and love and choosing each other every day. Inside, they could hear the children arguing about something, Joshua's voice rising above the others. Natalie sighed. I should go referee before someone starts crying. I'll come too. We're a team, remember? They walked into their home together, into the chaos and noise and beautiful mess of their family. The children needed attention. Supper needed finishing, and there were 1,000 small tasks that made up the fabric of their lives. But through it all, Kyle and Natalie moved in synchronization, partners who'd learned each other's rhythms, who worked together without needing words, who'd built something extraordinary from the ashes of loss and rejection. That night, after the children were finally asleep and the house was quiet, Kyle and Natalie returned to their bedroom. It had been a long day and they were both tired, but there was a contentment in their fatigue. Thank you, Natalie said as they prepared for bed. For everything. For choosing us, for loving us, for being exactly who we needed. Kyle crossed to her and cupped her face in his hands, the same gesture he'd made the day he'd first told her he loved her. Thank you for being brave enough to love again. Thank you for giving me Thomas and Katie and Joshua and Sarah. Thank you for building this life with me. I know it hasn't always been easy, but I wouldn't trade a single moment. Not even the drought year, she teased. Not even that. It taught us we could survive anything together. That's a valuable lesson. They climbed into bed and Kyle pulled Natalie close, her back to his chest, his arm secure around her waist. It was how they slept most nights, tangled together even after 10 years of marriage. I love you, she whispered into the darkness. I love you too, he replied. 2 hearts to love instead of one, remember? Best decision I ever made. Outside, the Texas night was vast and star-filled. The ranch was quiet, cattle settled, horses drowsing in the barn, children safe in their beds. And in the main house, Kyle and Natalie Anderson fell asleep, secure in the love they'd built and the family they'd created. Their story a testament to the power of choosing love over fear, hope over despair, and partnership over going it alone. The years continued to unfold with all the joys and challenges that came with ranching life in Texas. Thomas grew into a man who eventually took over more and more of the ranch's day-to-day operations, allowing Kyle to slow down slightly as he aged. At 25, Thomas married a schoolteacher from Pecos, a kind young woman who loved the ranch almost as much as he did. They built a house on the far end of the property and started their own family, giving Kyle and Natalie grandchildren to spoil. Katie followed her own path, fierce and independent like her mother. She married a neighboring rancher and proved to be a skilled horsewoman and businesswoman, managing her husband's ranch affairs with the same competence Natalie had shown. Joshua and Sarah grew and thrived, each finding their own way in the world while remaining connected to the land and family that had shaped them. Through it all, Kyle and Natalie remained the center, the foundation upon which everything else was built. They grew older together, silver threading through their hair, lines deepening on their faces, but their love only strengthened with time. On their 20th anniversary, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, Kyle raised a glass in a toast. "To my wife," he said, his voice still strong despite his 50 years, "who was rejected for having a child and who gave me the greatest gift when I said there were two hearts to love instead of one. Every day with you has been a privilege, Natalie. Every day has been a gift." Natalie, tears streaming down her face, raised her own glass. "To my husband who saw value where others saw burden, who gave us a home and a family and a love that has sustained us through everything. You are my heart, Kyle Anderson, now and always." Their children cheered, and Thomas, now 27 and a father himself, stood to add his own toast. "To the man who chose to be my father when he didn't have to, and who has never once made me feel anything less than completely his son. Thank you, Dad, for showing me what it means to be a good man and a good father." There wasn't a dry eye in the house by the time the toasts were finished. That night, alone in their bedroom after the celebrations had ended, Kyle and Natalie reflected on their journey. 20 years, Natalie marveled. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like you've always been mine." "I have always been yours," Kyle said. "From the moment I saw you arrive in Pecos with Thomas, something in me recognized something in you. I just had to wait until the time was right to claim you." "Claim me?" She raised an eyebrow, amused. "Maybe that's the wrong word. To prove I was worthy of you, that's closer to the truth. You proved that the moment you looked at my son and saw him for who he was, not as an obstacle. You gave us both a life, Kyle, a real life, full of love and purpose and family. I can never repay that. There's nothing to repay. You gave me just as much. You gave me a ready-made family when I was alone, working myself to death with no higher purpose than profit. You gave me a reason to build something lasting. You gave me love, Natalie, real love that has made every day worth living." They held each other in the darkness, comfortable in the silence that comes from decades of partnership. Outside, the ranch they'd built together stretched across the Texas landscape, a legacy for their children and grandchildren. Inside, their love remained as strong as it had been on that September day in 1877, when a cowboy had looked at a widow with a child and seen not a burden but a blessing. Years passed, as they inevitably do. Kyle and Natalie aged gracefully, remaining active in ranch life even as Thomas took over more responsibilities. They spent their days watching grandchildren grow, tending their garden, and sitting on the porch watching the land they both loved. When Kyle finally passed at the age of 73, peacefully in his sleep after a full day of work, he'd insisted on completing despite everyone's protests. Natalie grieved, but not without gratitude. They'd had 37 years together, years filled with love and laughter, and the deep satisfaction of a life well lived. At his funeral, their children and grandchildren and even great-grandchildren gathered to celebrate a man who had built a legacy not just of land and cattle, but of love. Thomas, now 54 and gray himself, gave the eulogy. "My father," he said, and his voice broke on the word, "chose to be my father when he didn't have to. He looked at a scared 5-year-old boy who'd lost his first father and decided to be his second. He never once made me feel less than his other children. He loved me completely the way a father should. And in doing so, he taught me how to love my own children, how to be the kind of man who chooses love over convenience, family over ease, commitment over comfort. Dad, thank you. Thank you for choosing us. Thank you for giving Mom and me a home. Thank you for being the best father any son could ask for. The crowd wept openly, and Natalie, sitting in the front row surrounded by her children, felt the weight of her grief, but also the warmth of gratitude. Kyle had given her and Thomas everything, and in return, they'd given him a life of meaning and love. Natalie lived another 8 years after Kyle's passing, spending her final years surrounded by family on the ranch they'd built together. She told stories to her great-grandchildren about the early days, about arriving in Pecos with nothing but hope, about a cowboy who'd seen past her circumstances to the woman she was. When she passed quietly one spring morning at the age of 81, she was laid to rest beside Kyle under a cottonwood tree on the ranch. Their graves were marked with simple stones that bore their names, their dates, and a simple inscription that Thomas had chosen: 2 hearts, forever one. The ranch continued through the generations, managed by Thomas and his descendants, a testament to what Kyle and Natalie had built. But more than land and property, their real legacy was the family they'd created, the love they'd modeled, and the proof that sometimes the greatest blessings come from taking a chance on love, even when the world says it's too complicated, too risky, too much. In the end, Kyle Anderson had been right that day in Mrs. Patterson's yard. 2 hearts to love instead of one wasn't a burden. It was a gift, a blessing, and the beginning of something extraordinary.